I have a couple of guests that are going to join me with some good news, something that has happened in Louisville, Kentucky, that I think all of us should be very proud of. And this is something I think we need to make happen in every state, every city that is experiencing gentrification. The news came my way the other day how Louisville plans to keep residents from being priced out of their neighborhoods. Let's go ahead and bring them in. I will bring in Jacory and we'll bring in Loretta. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. So first and foremost, I want both of you to introduce yourself, and then we'll get into this initiative here in Louisville. I'll start with Loretta. Ladies first.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Loretta Lees. I'm director of the Initiative on Cities at Boston University. As you can tell, I have an English accent, but I've been living in Boston for nearly 3 years now.
Awesome. And welcome. So you're here with me. Welcome.
I am.
Jacory.
Peace. I'm Jacory Arthur. I'm on City Council in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm also a teacher at Simmons College of Kentucky, our state's very first historically Black college.
Awesome. Well, thank both of you for coming on. Housing is a really big issue that I try to touch on this show quite a bit. And I saw this article, actually someone sent it to me, what you have been able to accomplish in Louisville. We just gave a talk recently at the Community Church of Boston about the housing issue, about gentrification, about people being priced out of their neighborhoods, and also about private equity owning housing and what we can try to do to combat this. And lo and behold, I saw this article that was sent to me and I said, well, Louisville has been able to do something. So the first thing I want to ask you guys is, first and foremost, why did you see that this was a need in Louisville, Kentucky? And is there some form of gentrification that is happening there as well? We'll go ahead and start with Jacory.
Absolutely. So I started writing this legislation in 2020. And just to give some context, 2020, Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky was killed by our local police department. So a number of us were protesting. We were organizing around police accountability, but also looking at larger issues that are just consequences of police. And we wanted to make sure that we did something that was bold, something that was big, and something that would change the system here in Louisville. So I worked with local tenant organizers over the course of my entire term on Metro Council to write this legislation, but it started in 2020. And we noticed that housing, of course, is unaffordable, whether you're talking about paying for rent, you're talking about your mortgage. People are getting displaced from their communities. And when you're displaced from your community, you really have one of three places to go. Of course, you can end up unhoused, somewhere in a junkyard. You can end up committing some sort of crime or living a life where you end up in a prison yard, or because of so much data and research shows us life expectancy changes when your housing is unstable, you end up in a graveyard. So a junkyard, prison yard, or graveyard. And we didn't want that happening for our people. So we realized over the course of time, the private market does so much to displace people and drive up costs because the private market cares about profits. At the same time, your local government is in partnership with the private market, and it's involved in making investments in development. So our legislation does three things. It keeps developers from building projects with your local government resources, whether it's land, property, some sort of letter of support. It keeps them from building something that is going to displace you by making them go through some sort of assessment. Two, it also creates a commission to hold the government accountable to make sure that's being implemented properly. And then three, the commission can launch investigations for anyone who was victim of housing discrimination and get restitution, whether that's land, down payment assistance for a home, or getting that land back that you were on or that property back that you were on. So we saw a need because the housing market is crushing us in our city.
Awesome. And Loretta, how did you become a part of this project? Because I know, again, you're here with me in Massachusetts at Boston University. How did you become involved with what was happening in Louisville?
Yeah, so basically there was a call for academics to develop the tool with the city of Louisville, and we kind of answered that call. But before that, we actually talked with the Louisville Tenants Union to get a sense of, you know, the kind of history behind this call, to get more kind of clear information about the anti-displacement ordinance that Jacory has talked about itself, and just get the kind of general landscape before applying to do the work. So our own team, so I'm an international expert on gentrification and displacement. I've done an awful lot of work all over the world on this, including legal work, fighting in public inquiries and other things. Worked a lot with tenant unions in other parts of the world, but also in the US. And one of my colleagues, Kenton Card, who has been, working quite hard with the LA Tenants Union, he also heard about this through connections in the kind of union movement as well. So lots of different reasons why we got involved.
This is amazing. I'm trying to encourage people to get involved locally, because I do feel like, for the most part, all politics is local. I think we have another member that is coming in. Bellamy, if you can hear me, we just need you to turn on your camera. When you're ready, just give me a thumbs up and I'll let you in. One of the questions that I have with Louisville is about the gentrification, because I think a lot of times people discuss this and they think of cities like New York, DC, San Francisco is a big one. Probably one of the first ones we started discussing was San Francisco. But I've been trying to explain to people this is happening all across the country. I went to Louisville a couple of years ago. I was there for a wedding, and I was actually surprised at even a couple of years ago, I saw it. And I just said to myself, like, gentrification has made its way here too, in Louisville. And what would you say has been the cause of gentrification in Louisville? For example, we can point to the tech industry in Boston. We can also point to the startups that came here in Boston that caused some of that. But what do you feel? Is there any particular sector, employment sector in Louisville that you think may have aided to some of that gentrification?
Well, there's quite a bit of factors, but I'll focus on something that Kentucky is known for, and that's the Kentucky Derby, which happens in Louisville, Kentucky at Churchill Downs. And over the years, our previous mayor kind of coined this term called bourbonism. And because of that, there's a huge prioritization of bourbonism, the Kentucky Derby, and tourists, which means, of course, they want to put as much investment as they can in downtown, in hotels, and development for guests that are simply passing through our city. The neighborhood that I live in is in the west end of Louisville. That is the neighborhood with the highest concentration of Black people, and it's just west of downtown Louisville. We also had a housing project called Beecher Terrace that was right next to downtown. And that project, because of federal funding through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, was essentially redeveloped. And most of the people who lived there wanted to come back, but were unable to come back because they did not rebuild the same amount of housing units. They did not keep the same amount of affordable housing. They turned some of them into homeownership, which is unattainable for so many people. And it contributed to gentrification. We have a housing needs assessment that was published in 2019 that our city government paid for. And it showed and it revealed that the city investment in redevelopment of those housing projects and so many other projects similar to Beecher Terrace contributed to the private market speculating and looking at our neighborhoods and really picking the meat off the bones of them and trying to come in and put people on the back burner instead of prioritizing a basic need, which is housing. So I think the bourbon industry has really led to gentrification more than almost anything else in Louisville.
Can I just add to that's a really interesting point, that second tier cities, so the smaller cities, not the big New York, San Francisco's and Chicago, are probably the key gentrification frontiers in the US at the moment. The gentrification has saturated those big cities. So, most of the research that people would want to look at now is on these kind of lower tier cities. And what's specific about them is they have a very particular image and branding that goes with that they try to make their city unique, as Jacori just said.
And I want to bring in Bellamy. I'll bring you in just a second, but this is the warning I've been sounding to people. There was an article written here by the Boston Globe that was recommending that college graduates who cannot afford to live in Boston or complaining about the cost of housing to start moving to Michigan, right? And I warned people against that because I saw that happen to Nashville, Tennessee, where a number of people started moving there, and now there's gentrification there, and Nashville is more expensive. So I always tell people the long-term solution is not to move to another city, because once that becomes a trend, gentrification is going to make its way there as well. Let's bring in Bellamy. Can you please introduce yourself and tell everybody how you're involved with the Louisville project?
Absolutely. My name is Jessica Bellamy. I'm the lead organizer of the anti-displacement ordinance campaign. I was part of writing it and organizing it for all of these 4 years because we're in our fourth year of our campaign. It was only publicly launched last year, and the fight has been consistent. Yeah, proud to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. Another question I have for all of you is, so this seems to be making its way in Louisville. Loretta, since you're right here in Boston, do you think there's an opportunity for something like this to happen in Boston? I know Ja'Cory said that he wrote legislation, and I'm wondering, has there been any pitches towards local politicians here in Boston to do the same?
Yeah, so really interestingly, what we did is we hooked up the city of Boston with the city of Louisville, because Boston has been redoing all its kind of anti-displacement policy and practice. And they were supposed to release it just before Thanksgiving. So it's supposed to be coming out anytime soon. So yes, one of the things that we kind of want to do is get different cities to learn from each other. And then off the back of this, we've just been contacted by Greenville in South Carolina, who's very interested in this toolkit and wants to do something similar there. So we're kind of hoping that other cities, because it's kind of Creative Commons, will be able to copy this, obviously with the specifics of their own gentrifications and their own cities.
That's awesome to hear. Bellamy, I'm going to pivot back to you. In reference to displacement, if you had to guess, how many people would you say in Louisville have been displaced or are at risk of being displaced?
Oh, so many neighborhoods that are at either moderate to severe risk of displacement and growing as rents continue to increase due to the level of development happening, much of which that was funded by the city, that this ordinance is trying to mitigate, right? For our public resources to actually go to the housing that not only that we can afford, but that can help keep us in place. I know from my home neighborhood of Smoketown, we've lost, based on the changes in the census, looking back at 2015 to about now, I believe the last time we looked at that data, it was over 500 households that had changed, going from losing so many Black families, because Smoketown is one of the oldest historically Black neighborhoods in our city. It was one of the few places that Black folks were allowed to live after the Civil War. And if you look at census data in 2015, the average income level for Smoketown was around $25,000 per year. And since the level of gentrification that followed, the way in which Hope 6, which is a federal initiative that came out of the Clinton administration that got new life under the Obama administration, where they look at public housing and say these are areas of concentrated poverty and crime, and push folks out to build mixed income homes. When Hope 6 happens in an area, there are a number of developers that follow that level of development, because you have this huge push out of people in an area where parcels of land are cheaper, right? A lot more affordable. Like, you used to be able to buy a house for about $12,000 even in my neighborhood. And so you can buy this land for cheap and start flipping it for high to maximize your profit. And you can start telling a narrative about benefiting a place so that you can get access to government subsidies such as public land, public dollars, staff support, even if you're pricing folks out, which for Smoketown specifically, we saw nonprofits get access to those resources and start flipping houses at $150,000 a pop, till where we get to the 2020s, where the private market then starts flipping houses for over $200K, to the point where we get to 2023, just last year, where there was a house for sale in Smoketown that was $325,000. My family home has even doubled in property taxes in the last year from the level of gentrification in the area. Even though there hasn't been improvements to these properties that would justify those price tags, much like the property valuation of my family home, where there hasn't been the type of investment into my home or development into my home for it to justify going from 30,000 to over 100,000 in value, which then ticked up my property taxes, making it even harder for me to maintain, to being here. Yeah.
Yeah,
I hope that
it's
answers your
interesting.
questions.
First time I heard someone say you get a house for $12,000. So that was interesting to me. Ja'Cory, when people have been displaced in Louisville, where do they move to?
Well, that's a part of the issue. People get scattered in all sorts of places. Sometimes it's into other public housing, if we're talking about the redevelopment of our local housing authority properties. Sometimes, like I said, people end up unhoused and our shelters are full. We've been doing a lot of work on changing our shelter regulations, but at the end of the day, people need affordable housing. And it's important to know, because we had a lot of criticism as we worked on this, that people often pointed to us trying to protect folks in their housing as keeping them poor. Our assessment and our legislation is income based. So many of like revitalization efforts are based on benefiting a place, like Jessica said, instead of the people that actually live there. So if people in the area, if they increase their incomes, of course, that assessment is going to change, and we could allow more development to come into that area that costs more. But until those incomes change and increase, we do not think that the housing should increase. We think that it's a travesty that we have housing increase and other costs increasing, but people's wages are staying the same, and in some cases going backwards. It's also important to know that there's such a stigma around poor people being synonymous with poor housing. Just because your income is low does not mean that your housing itself should be of low quality. And oftentimes, just because we're deconcentrating poverty does not mean we are abolishing poverty. When we abolish poverty, we're making it easier for people to live by lowering costs, in some cases giving them direct assistance, like our pilot guaranteed income program that we had. But deconcentrating it isn't abolishing poverty. It's really just abolishing people and displacing them, whether they end up in jail, they end up in a shelter, they end up on the streets, or they end up dead.
Well said. If you're just joining us, again, we're discussing how Louisville plans to keep residents from being priced out of their neighborhoods. So this happened very heavily here in Boston. I've been here for a little over 13 years now, and there was gentrification starting when I moved here. But it is incredibly ridiculous now. And the reason why I asked, like, where are people moving? Because a lot of people here, if you ever come to Boston, more than likely, especially if you're in Boston proper, you're not going to hear the Boston accent unless you're coming as a tourist and you're on one of those duck tours or something like that. A lot of the people that were born here and raised here have been pushed out, and they've moved further south in Massachusetts, or they move into like the North Shore. Even the North Shore has become pretty expensive now. So gentrification does spread. This is something that I do want people who are watching to understand. That's why I say the solution is not for people to have to move and then also probably still have a long commute because they are further away from the city, and a lot of the jobs are concentrated in the city in particular. Ja'Cory, how were you able to get this legislation passed? There have been a number of initiatives I know here locally when it comes to housing where it seems like the developers continue to get their way.
Organizing. We always say and follow a model that the power of the people is stronger than the people in power. I got 30,000 constituents. There's one of me. The mayor has over 800,000 constituents. There's one of him. So how can you bring together the masses to put pressure on politicians to support this? And, Jessica led this campaign, and she can speak about some of the tactics that we used. But when we first filed this legislation, the only person who supported it was me as a sponsor of it. And then eventually, because of the organizing, because of calls, because of emails, because of meetings that were had with people's city council member, because of people coming to speak at city council, at city hall, telling their story and sharing their struggles, with the public, it changed the whole landscape of politics here in Louisville. And I'm excited because not only did we organize and build power to pass this legislation, but passing this legislation is really just the start. Of course, we want to pass something similar in other cities, but if you can pass anti-displacement law in your city, that positions you to also pass other legislation in your city because you've built a base of people who have changed the political dynamic in your city. And I want to pass the mic to Jessica because she led that campaign, and I kind of did the inside game and she did the outside game, and we worked together real closely, and then eventually worked with our academics to make it all function together and actually get something passed. And I also found out when we first started working with the academics, the reason that other cities don't have legislation like this where they're assessing development is because it didn't pass. So what we did was so unique, and we don't get a lot of wins, so we got to celebrate those. So Sabby, thank you for celebrating with us.
Of course. Jessica, I want to hear about some of the strategies that you used.
Absolutely, yes. Because for our city, for as progressive as it likes to think of itself as and compassionate, it's a pretty conservative, locked up kind of space. And so what we did was we rallied constituents. We built relationships in all 26 voting districts of Jefferson County, talking with people on porches in their living rooms, inviting them in, not just to sign petitions or anything like that, but also like to take on deeper roles within the campaign, building relationships, tapping into their own relationships, but constantly standing on, I don't want to say standing on the neck of these council members, but really with council members, you can get what you want or you can get what you fear. And we encourage you to be a champion and stand with us. But we already know there is no political will to do right by us, and that really only folks that are directly impacted by these issues are the ones who have the urgency to see it addressed and the ones who have the accuracy to know where the problem is. Only the person wearing the shoe knows where it pinches. And so the more of us that stood together, especially concentrating on individual council members, moving those votes forward, at community meetings, showing up in council meetings, but constantly being a presence, phone zaps, emails, so many letter writing campaigns, creative ways. And we ended up building a huge base around this, which actually led us to create an even larger initiative and mission and an organization to encapsulate that. We now have created Push Louisville, which stands for People United for Social Housing, because the dream of getting control over these public resources is for us to be able to use them. It's great if developers are ready now to start building, great. Then that ready is there for you. You can jump ahead of the line if you are building projects that will match the neighborhoods in which you are developing these projects in. But also for anywhere where we might have shortfall, we are very much interested in community control, community land trusts, because these are our options for creating not only affordable options, but permanently affordable options, and ones that are governed under the types of boundaries, restrictions, and covenants that we have come to know to be just and fair for our communities. And so we're very excited about the future, but it took building tons and tons and tons and tons of relationships and activating people in a multitude of ways to really push at their council person to either stand with us. You can get that pat on the back and you can wear the crown and be a champion, or we might hold your feet to the fire, but you're going to get across that line,
Well said. And I think this is important for people to hear how the strategy played out. Ja'Cory said he wrote the legislation in 2020. So these things do take time. I know sometimes we want things to move at a faster pace, but considering he wrote that in 2020 is 2024 and we're already seeing this in place, I would say this moved faster than I could have imagined. I know sometimes when it comes to legislation, things can definitely be held up, even when it comes to the state level, not just with Congress. Loretta, one of the things I want to ask you, you mentioned that we're seeing more gentrification in the medium-sized cities. Is there any correlation with the college towns? And I'm asking because, again, that article that was written in the Boston Globe encouraging college graduates to move to Michigan, like in Ann Arbor, Michigan, or Madison, Wisconsin? Are we seeing any correlation between gentrification in those college towns as well?
In some college towns, yes, but it's not as simple as that. So, I mean, there's other examples. So, for example, artists in New York who moved out to Austin in Texas, for example, you know, kind of going the small city direction. And that's different to students and going for that kind of college thing. But I think what universities and colleges are trying to do now is to retain their talent, retain their students in place, particularly in those smaller cities. They don't want them going off to the New Yorks and the kind of LAs and San Franciscos. They want to keep that talent in-house. But of course, keeping that talent in-house when you've already got an affordability crisis is a real problem. And it has all sorts of different impacts. But I think one thing that's really important about this story in general is how here we have these amazing people in Louisville who've done this tremendous grassroots activism and kind of fought back against state-enabled gentrification. Because gentrification is not just private bodies, it is state-enabled, whether it's the redevelopment of public housing, whether it's, you know, giving public subsidies to certain developers to go into certain areas. And that's the real issue. And one of the reasons that I think this is going to be most successful is because it's going to really get the state or the city to kind of sit back a bit more and think carefully about where it's going to locate these developments and redevelopments.
One of the things I noticed too, there was an article I read recently where there have been a number of cities that are declining in residents, whether it's not these residents are moving or they're retiring. That's a big one that's happening, particularly here in some parts in New England. There are just doctors and dentists that are retiring, and these small communities don't have, they said, we need more dentists, we need more doctors, etc. There was an article that was announcing that they were going to pay people to move to Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to get your perspective about that, Loretta. What about these projects in certain cities where they do have a decline of residents that are offering payment for people to relocate to those cities? Is that a good thing or a bad thing in your opinion?
It's becoming increasingly a common practice, but for different reasons in different cities. It potentially is a good thing for the cities involved in that, you know, there are potentially employment opportunities there that need to be filled and maybe the local population can't fill them. However, any kind of in-movement of different and new people, particularly upper middle class groups, into a city tends to trigger processes of gentrification. And of course, many of these smaller cities are already suffering lots of different kind of social issues, you know, from marginalization to industrial decline and other stuff that this kind of new body of people is not naturally going to do anything about, if that makes sense. You know, you kind of need a mixed economy going forward. It's not just the kind of add-ons and these kind of prestige jobs.
And this is something that they said in Montreal. I was in Montreal over the summer, and I actually did a tour for once when I went there. And the tour guide said that Montreal has one of the highest or one of the happiest places for people to live in there. I'm like, it's really cold, but whatever. But it's based on the quality of living. And they said that they have developed these mixed, this mixed economy where there are no ghettos. They're not allowed anymore in Montreal. Everybody's just kind of mixed in. They're like, there's not a wealthy neighborhood and a poor neighborhood. They outlawed that because they said that, you know, obviously not just some form of discrimination, but it has some type of effect on a child's psychological well-being. So they said that they could not do that anymore. No ghettos, none of that. Everybody's just mixed income all together. And that was really interesting to me because it's not what we see here in the United States. I think one more question that I do have is, Ja'Cory, you're in city council. I remember when you ran for city council, a lot of people would ask the question, why did you decide to run for city council and not Congress, for example? And I've been trying to encourage people, if they can, to attend city council meetings, because I do think there's a lot that city council does that people just aren't aware of. And some people don't even know who their city councilors are. But why did you decide to make that decision?
I ran for city council just because I had spent so many years teaching about, I'm a musician, making music about, and doing activism around these issues. And when the seat was available, I figured because we are in the position we're in because of policy, I should go in and try to change that policy to try to reverse some of the outcomes we've been suffering from. So that's why I ran for city council. And it's important to know that anybody should do it, even if you don't feel like you're going to win, just because you get so much experience learning about your community. You get experience organizing. You also get to better understand how local government works. I've learned so much over the past few years, and I learned so much every single day that I never knew about government. And that's why this legislation is so important. We don't realize that the decisions your local city council member or your mayor make on a daily basis are going to impact your life in ways that can be really consequential. So if your government is funding gentrification in your community, you can replace the city council member. You can influence that city council member to introduce a policy like this and impact that. So I ran for city council because I believe that all politics is local, like you said, and I wanted to get more involved, and I won. I'm the youngest Metro Council person in our city history. And it's important to say that, not for identity's sake, but just because there's an urgency with some of our generations that are struggling with some of these issues. You know, we might have parents and grandparents who had homes, and over time, things have gotten a lot worse for us. So working in lockstep with our tenant movement, with organizers like Jessica, is really important when you're trying to pass policy. You cannot solely rely on politicians. You yourself have to get more involved, and you yourself have to organize for change. I know this election just happened, and so many people have a lot of feelings about it. We got to organize, no matter if it's election season or not. That vote is probably one of the easiest political tools that you can pick up and use. But what are you doing after that? How are you influencing your local government, your state government? And I think that it's an opportunity for a lot of people to channel that energy into building political power. And it doesn't have to be in passing policy. It doesn't have to be in getting people elected. In some cases, it can be like our local tenant union that's doing work around trying to get fair leases and better conditions, or a labor union trying to make sure they get better wages and better benefits. There are so many opportunities to organize. We just have to do a better job at activating people, like Jessica mentioned, because so many people are disengaged for whatever reason. But if you can get them involved, you can tell your story, share your struggle. Hopefully it inspires them to get more involved. And then, of course, you can make changes like the one we're talking about tonight.
That's right. And Loretta, we have one more question. It is for you. Can you ask Loretta about the universal healthcare in London? I want her to speak to the myth of universal healthcare being so much worse or slower than our healthcare Sabby.
Okay, not really about gentrification, but yeah, interesting one. So yeah, but after coming to Boston and experiencing private healthcare, I would probably say that the British healthcare is better. Not only does everybody have equal access, but it's not as bad as people kind of make it out to be in the media by any stretch.
Yeah, that's what I've been trying to explain to people. Yeah. Of course, you know, they're going to tell you things that like, no, you don't want to do that. That's going to be bad for everybody. But I'm like, that's not what I've heard from people in those places.
Cradle to grave healthcare for everybody, and everybody is equal across the board, which, you know, is wonderful, really.
All right. Thank all of you so much. Thank you so much. And is there a website, or where can people go to follow either one of you?
I'll pass the mic to Jessica to push the organizing that she's doing and just kind of plug in how we can get connected.
Yes.
All right.
And we'll be launching the push.org website in the month of December. So look for that. It'll be.
Oh, I think you muted yourself, Jessica. Oh, you said you'll be, could you say that again? Sorry.
I was saying that, absolutely. I know my internet connection's a little weak today. But we will be launching the pushlouisville.org website, December 1st. And so, be looking for that. We'll be posting on social media for more folks to be able to find us, but continued campaign information and the evolution of how we use these public resources and what political decisions folks, working class people will be making in Louisville next will be available.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Hey guys, this was a Sabby clip. If you like what you saw, hit that like button and subscribe.